Hi, welcome to Lanas y Ovillos. My name is Alba, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this blouse. You can see that it's open on the back side. It's really easy to make. You only have to make 2 rectangles, and you have the cross stitch on the front part, on the top part of the blouse, and the same on the back part. The top part is with the crossed stitch and the stockinette stitch on the bottom part. I will explain you how you can adapt this blouse to any size. So let's go with a step by step. To make this blouse in a small size, I used 230 grams of this cotton. The recommended needle is between 4 and 6 millimeters, and I am using a 5.5 knitting needles, scissors, and a needle. I'm going to show you how you can adapt this pattern to any size. This blouse is made of 2 rectangles. The size that you have to take is from one shoulder to the other shoulder. This part, you have to start from this part and then make the crossed stitch that I will explain to this part, and then make the stockinette stitch to the end. This is the front part, and to make the back part of the blouse you have to make the same with the crossed stitch, and then with the stockinette stitch you will have to separate one part of the other part. Well, start now with the crossed stitch. You have to cast on the number of stitches that you need to have the size of the blouse, remember, from one shoulder to the other shoulder. You have to cast on stitches multiple of 2. So cast on the stitches. And now we start the first row. This is not a part of the crossed stitch, but it's the row to prepare to make the crossed stitch. You have to make one row with the knit stitch. Knit all the stitches of this row. Row number 2. You are now on the back, on the wrong side of the blouse, and you have to take the edge stitch, purl 1, and you have to work now the stitches in pairs. Those 2 stitches you have to work those 2 stitches together. You have to purl the second stitch, you don't have to remove the stitch from the needle, and you have to purl the first stitch. Now you can remove the stitches from the needle and continue with the 2 following stitches. Purl the second stitch. You don't have to remove the stitch from the needle, and purl the first stitch. This is what you have to repeat to have only 2 stitches. Purl the second stitch and purl the first stitch, and then remove the stitches from the needle. Repeat the same to the end. Once you are at the end, you have to purl the 2 last stitches. Turn. This is the second row that you have to repeat to make the crossed stitch. You are now on the right side of the blouse, and you have to take the edge stitch, and now you have to work those 2 stitches together. You have to knit the second stitch, but taking the back loop. You don't have to remove the stitch from the needle, and you have to knit the first stitch. Now you have to remove the stitches from the needle and work the 2 following stitches. Knit the second stitch taking the back loop and knit the first stitch. Now remove those stitches from the needle. Repeat again. Knit the second stitch taking the back loop, knit the first stitch and remove both stitches from the needle. This is what you have to repeat to the end. And the last stitch you have to purl the last stitch. Once you finish the row, you have to turn, and I will explain you one more time how to make the crossed stitch. Row in the wrong side, you have to take the edge stitch, purl 1 and work the following 2 stitches together. Purl the second stitch and purl the first stitch and remove both stitches from the needle. Continue with the 2 following stitches. Purl the first stitch, you don't have to remove the stitch from the needle, and purl the first stitch. Repeat to the end. And once you have only 2 stitches, you have to purl both stitches. Row in the right side, you have to take the edge stitch and work the 2 following stitches together. You have to knit the second stitch, you don't have to remove the stitch from the needle, knit the first stitch, and now you have to remove the stitch from the needle. Continue with the 2 following stitches. Knit the back loop of the second stitch and knit the first stitch. Repeat the same to the end. And remember, purl the last stitch. You have to repeat the crossed stitch to arrive at the to the breast. Now you have to work the front and the back part of the blouse in a different way. To make the front part of the blouse, you have to start working the stockinette stitch. You have, if you are in a row in the right side, you have to start making one knit stitch to the end, knit stitch to the end, and the last stitch you have to purl the last stitch in all the rows. Once you have the knit stitch, you have to turn the work and work one purl stitch on each stitch of this row, making the stockinette stitch. Turn again and work one knit stitch to the end, and remember, purl the last stitch. And repeat one more time a row in the wrong side with the purl stitch. This is what you have to repeat to have the length of the blouse that you need. Once you are at the end, you have to make 3 rows with the garter stitch, you have to make 3 rows with the knit stitch, remember, purl the last stitch, 3 rows with the knit stitch, and once you have the 3 rows with the knit stitch, the 4th row of the garter stitch, you will have to bind off all the stitches. Remember how to bind off. You have to knit one again, and pass the first stitch over the second stitch, knit one and pass the previous stitch over the next stitch, and this is how you have to bind off all the stitches. Once you made the front part, you have to repeat the same with the crossed stitch in the back part. If you are at the right side of the blouse, you have to start with the knit stitch, and if you are in the wrong side of the blouse, you have to start with the purl stitch. So we have to make the stockinette stitch in all the stitches. Once you are, in my case, working the knit stitch to have the half of the stitches, you have to leave those stitches in one needle and continue working only the second half of the blouse. You have to work only the half of the stitches that you have. Work to the end the knit stitch, and once you are at the end, you have to turn and continue working the parallel stitch to the middle of the blouse. When you are on the middle of the blouse, you have to turn and work the knit stitch to the end. Remember, always purl the last stitch. Continue working the stockinette stitch. Remember, one row with a knit stitch, one row with the purl stitch to have the same size of the front part, and finish also this part with 3 rows of garter stitch and 1 row to bind off. Once you have one of the middles of the blouse, you have to take again the stitches that you have on the needle and start working the stockinette stitch on the second half, on the second middle of the blouse. Remember that
in my case I finished with a knit stitch row, so I have to start where I made the last stitch. So I have to start with a row in the wrong side, making the purl stitch. So purl all the stitches. And then turn again and work the stockinette stitch, and you have to make one row with the knit stitch and one row with the purl stitch to the end, and repeat the same that you made on the other part of the blouse. Once you have the two parts, you have to sew the sides of the blouse. And you finish the blouse. And 10 centimeters of the shoulders.
Well, that's all. I hope you like it. Remember to give a like, share and subscribe to receive the notifications on my new videos.